Mexico City. Ringed by mountains and home to over 20 million people. But what we know now as Mexico City was not always called such. Indeed, the land and the buildings have changed much over the city's nearly 700 years of history. What started as one of many city-states vying for power in the Valley of Mexico grew into a floating garden city at the heart of the lake Texcoco. Called Tenochtitlan by the inhabitants, the Aztec had managed a marvel to turn the major constraint of the region into a strength of their city. The Valley of Mexico has no outlet to the sea, so any water that falls will pool at the lowest point and slowly siphon down through the soil. This, of course, is much slower than having a river carry any excess water away, and this causes a notable risk of flooding in the valley. As Maudsley writes, the preoccupation of the rulers of the city of Mexico, whether Aztec caciques, Spanish viceroys, or Republican presidents, has been the defense of the city against inundations, that is to say, floods. This is why the Aztecs' floating garden city was so brilliant. Instead of attempting to dissuade the course of nature, they took the water as a fact of life and built around it so that it became an asset to them for their floating gardens and aqueducts with which they fed their city. And this was reflected in their architecture, primarily building using adobe, stone, clay, and stucco, and other water-resistant materials so as to best hold off any problems that might emerge from long-term contact with standing water. While the cultural legacy of the Aztecs would not disappear entirely, it did lose its dominant position architecturally and culturally with the coming of the Spanish. The arrival of the Spanish is a pivotal moment in the history of the city, not just for their raising of the old Tenochtitlan or the building of the new city of Mexico, but for the completely different approach and needs of the Spanish as a colonial power as compared to the Aztecs as the endemic culture of the region. The Spanish viewed the lakes that characterized the Valley of Mexico as a nuisance. They soon began efforts to drain the lakes and remake the region as a copy of Spanish itself. The draining of the lakes marks a turning point in the city, where it begins to be culturally and architecturally unmoored from the environment around it. But the Spanish influence is not something of pure malice. They brought with them different ideas of how to build and what should be built. Indeed, many grand stone cathedrals still stand and form the definitive image of the city of Mexico in the minds of many. The primary issues facing Mexico City during and after the Spanish rule were a result of the different and more extractive relationship the Spanish had for the land than of their actual building practices and ideals. The ravenous hunt for gold, the draining of the lakes for cattle grazing, the building upon what was once lake bed, the sinking of the city. These all stem from a culture that viewed the land as something to be overcome, rather than something to work in tandem with. And while most of the architecture during the colonial period was limited by necessity, there was only so much a pre-industrial society could build with it. It would be a culture that would plant the hunger that would enter full bloom with industrialization and the 20th century. A hunger that would form a massive sinking pit at the heart of the city.
While there are many beautiful and elegantly designed buildings that grace Mexico City, Many of them suffer from the problem of not being regionalized to fit the unique situation that the city faces. Mexico City is by many metrics a city that faces many problems stemming from pollution of both air and water. As Collins and Scott write, intense year-round sunshine at this latitude and elevation reacts with unburned hydrocarbons to form ozone-rich photochemical smog. However, these low-level winds are not strong enough to push pollutants out of the basin. The air is like the water in the city of Mexico, a delicate thing that cannot flush. Despite these issues, many continue to use whatever materials are most economical, even if they come at a steep price for both the environment, naturally and built. It's unavoidable to speak to the inequality that defines Mexico City for many of its residents, even here in architecture. For many, the built environment is roughshod and in disrepair. Housing is often crowded and in some ways hostile or indifferent to providing for those who reside within it. Remedying the materials used to build and the relationship to the lakes and the land that still to this day characterizes this place are only the first step. It means very little if these innovations are locked behind fantastical price tags and prohibitively onerous burdens on those who wish to live in a more just relationship to the land that makes Mexico City possible. It is not so simple as we return to the Aztec way of doing things. The conditions that created the culture are long gone. We've got to pick up from where we are now with the intention of preventing any further harm. Our solution must serve the people who live there now, and a fusion of both Mexican and Aztec cultures is key to this. Modern architecture in Mexico City focuses on family legacy and civic pride. The idea of connecting generations in an aesthetically beautiful way with local resources has been a refreshing idea coming out of the capital city. The remnants of Gothic Spanish architecture and Aztec ruins remain visible alongside tall glass office buildings. Cathedrals are still a hub of religion in the city, illuminating unique lighting through stained glass windows, while nearby, inspiration for Musea Sumaya does the opposite illusion and reflects light back out onto the environment. Buildings like these are creating a future for the city while its mid-century modern history is still cradled in the architecture community. This is what makes Mexico City so intriguing to research. From the Aztec Empire to Spanish colonialism to its own independent country. A high-tech canal city to a diminishing lake bed to a mid-century modern test bed to its own architectural identity. The city shapes itself to be expansive and diverse.